And good morning, Mr. Arlinghouse. Today is Thursday, April 22nd. And hopefully today we can get pretty close to finishing this unit on World War II and move on. I also hope that, Mr. Arlinghouse, you are enjoying these pictures I keep sending you of the plane ride that I once took. I want you to be jealous and envy me, Mr. Arlinghouse. And so, yeah. Anyway, let's delve into this unit because once again, it's always if you notice, the last thing we did, we looked at, the effect of World War II in Nazi Germany, the effect of World War II in France. Now we're going to go to Great Britain. And so, yes, as it says, Britain for a while, for about 10 months, from 1940, from May of 1940 until 1941, December, Britain for a while stood alone in front of the Germans. Churchill took up the national resolve. Time magazine said that Winston Churchill is one of the 10 most important people of the 20th century. They also include in that list Adolf Hitler, for what that's worth, and Vladimir Lenin, for what that's worth, and Henry Ford, and John Lennon. I mean, I've got a little film. It's an interesting film to watch. But, Churchill was like Adolf Hitler, was a great communicator. And he had his flaws, too. For one thing, Churchill in World War I had lost a lot of British soldiers and armaments in the Gallipoli campaign. For another thing, Churchill was an imperialist. He believed that Britain had the right to have an empire, which included India. Churchill once said that Gandhi was nothing but a seditious, half-naked fakir, which is not a nice thing to say. And he drank a bit. He cried a lot. But the thing that his great strength was, his public face was one of eternal optimism. And it was difficult to keep eternal optimism with what the British faced for some 10 months. With the Blitzkrieg, the air raids, and of course the Japanese on the other side of the planet, making mincemeat of the British Empire. And so it was a tough go. The first order of business for Britain during this time was the production of airplanes. Lord Beaverbrook led the effort to produce more and more airplanes because airplanes, that was how Britain was going to defend itself. This showed the demand for more planes and other armaments inspired a massive campaign in Britain to reclaim scrap metal. This showed a civilian population enthusiastically engaged in the struggle, and they only do that with leadership. Churchill came on the radio on a regular basis, pumping up the nation. And another cool thing about Churchill was that his command of the English language, I think, has never been equaled. His ability to turn a phrase, his ability to write and create these inspiring speeches and words that could get people to press on. So, by the end of 1941, British production of war materials had already surpassed Germany's. Factory hours in Britain were extended. Women brought into the workforce, which once again the Germans did not do. Unemployment disappeared and people had more money. Those same people then were encouraged to save money and taxes were raised. The Blitz air attacks of the winter and spring of 1940 and 41 were the most immediate and pressing threat. German air raids killed 15,000 people in London alone. Not to mention there was one, now oftentimes the people of London would sleep in the subways because that was a makeshift bomb shelter. But there was also one time when one of those bombs was able to rupture a water pipeline and flooded one part of the subway, killing a large number of people. But yes, many children were sent to the countryside to get out from under the cities. This actually raised the standard of living for many children as their food and education were paid for. After the spring of 1941, with the Russian campaign, most, but not all, bombings ceased in Great Britain. By the end of the war, 30,000 British civilians had died in the air raids. And that's a terrible number. But to be honest, it really pales in comparison to the number of people who died in the German air raids. I mean, pales. The city of Dresden in southern Germany, which we'll talk about later, was firebombed. And what is terrible about the city of Dresden, there was nothing in it except for a lot of people and a children's hospital. And it was torched by napalm. While we're comparing notes and losses in World War II, Russia lost more people than any other country in World War II. They lost, the Soviet Union lost 1 in 7 people. And now do the math, 1 in 7 people died during World War II, which in the Soviet Union, or rather Russia, it's not called World War II, it's called the Great Patriotic War. So, at any rate, this bombing may have made the British more determined. The British made many sacrifices for the war effort, from consumer goods to heating oil and strict rationing. Personal cars almost disappeared from the British streets. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, I visited the BBC when I was over in Manchester. Terrible television, Mr. Arlinghouse. Terrible, just terrible. I mean, it's a bad thing when you're, I stayed in England, the UK, for 3 weeks back in 2013, and it's a bad thing when you watch TV and the best thing you have to look forward to are reruns of Frasier and Everybody Loves Raymond. You know what I'm saying here? And The Big Bang Theory. Reruns, of course. Terrible television. But anyway, the BBC sent programs to every country in Europe in the local language to encourage resistance. The most popular figure on these radio programs was Winston Churchill. The second was a comedy entitled It's That Man Again, which was a comedic radio broadcast filled with imaginary figures that the nation of Britain came to treasure. That man again, by the way, was Adolf Hitler. And they made fun of him. Sorry. For most people in Britain, the standard of living and health actually improved. The wartime experience may have contributed to the Labour Party's win in the election of 1945. I mean, here's an ironic thing. At the end of World War II, in 1945, Winston Churchill lost re-election. Yeah, people have short memories. All right, Roman number 24. The war against Germany came as a great surprise to Stalin and the Soviet Union. As it says there, no nation suffered greater loss of life in Soviet Union. 1 in 7 people died. 16 million, 1 in 7 people. Half the industrial cities were devastated. Thousands of Soviet citizens were forced to work in German factories. Stalin directed the war himself. And unlike Tsar Nicholas II, Stalin was a bit more competent and also a bit more hard-nosed. There's a saying, and I can't remember it. There's an order that Stalin issued to his armies in Stalingrad. And I used to remember the Russian for it. One day I'll remember it. But anyway, that order was not one step back. He told his generals that any general who considered Any general who considered retreating would be removed from his post and forced to commit suicide. I'm not forced to commit suicide. And you say, how do you force somebody to commit suicide? Oh, you threaten to kill their family or send them to gulag. Yeah, was a pretty common tactic in both Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union. So, not one step back. I almost have it, but I can't remember. Anyway, this country, because the purges were already on a wartime footing, the army gained more and more independence of the Communist Party, but was still under the close supervision of Joseph Stalin. Soviet propaganda was different, as the Soviets did not trust their own citizenry. The Soviet Union confiscated radios to keep the people from listening to German or British broadcast. Yeah, the Soviets didn't want their people listening to British broadcast either. The Soviet propaganda emphasized patriotism, as once again, this was and still is referred to as the Great Patriotic War. Sergei Eisenstein produced an epic film called Ivan the Terrible, which recalled the great Russian monarch. And there was Tolstoy's War and Peace. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was called the Leningrad Symphony. Mr. Longhouse, if I have not pointed it out, Leningrad. Leningrad is the city that today we call St. Petersburg. During the communist era in the Soviet Union, St. Petersburg was referred to as Leningrad. And in fact, the city that today is called Volgograd, back in the communist period, was called Stalingrad, which is kind of worth knowing. But yes, Stalin, in order to unify the country, reconciled with the Russian Orthodox Church. In Western Russia, there were many pockets of resistance to the presence of the Nazis. Some were soldiers who had been cut off and escaped. Stalin supported these partisans for two reasons. Number one, they caused as much difficulty as possible for the Germans. Number two, Soviet-sponsored resistance reminded people in those areas occupied by the Germans that they were still under control of the Soviet Union. See, here's the thing. You know, when the Nazi armies came marching into the Soviet Union, let's look at our map, please. When the Nazi armies came marching into the Soviet Union, yes, this is a post-war map, but it applies. You see all this in dark red, Mr. Arlinghouse? This in dark red, this is actually the Soviet Union. Notice, you say, well, what are these? Well, these, remember, the Soviet Union is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There are 15 of them. And Russia is simply the biggest one. These, until 1991, were all part of the Soviet Union republics, including the Ukraine. So when the Nazi armies came into Ukraine, many of the Ukrainians who hated the Russians, because the Soviet Union was little more than just a Russian empire, many Ukrainians welcomed the Germans, had big signs up, Willkommen Freunden, and made the Germans feel quite welcome, quite at home. And and that will, in fact, most of the concentration camps, Mr. Allinghouse, were staffed by Ukrainian soldiers who had gone over to the Nazis as soon as the Nazis invaded. But the thing was, Adolf Hitler thought that these Ukrainians were subhuman, and therefore he never used them as far as, in real actual battle. He pretty much brushed them off. But yeah, back to my hand. So, Soviet-sponsored resistance reminded the populace that they, being the Soviet Union, that the Communist Party, were still there. That these people, were still under control of the Soviet Union. As the war ended, Stalin and the Soviets emerged as a power second only to the United States. Yes, I mean, the war actually propelled Soviet Union into the status of superpower. The war consolidated and enhanced the power of Stalin and the Soviet Union to a much higher plane. The Soviet Union cooperated with Britain and the United States, but only when it was in their own best interest. There was not a tremendous amount of trust, as the Soviets were openly dedicated to the abolition of capitalism. And to be real honest, the West had been openly devoted to the abolition of communism. There was not a lot of trust going on. Remember, before the war, as it says there, the West was also hostile to Soviet intentions. The United States, that's an interesting statistic, did not recognize the Soviet Union as the rightful government of Russia until 1933, 15 years after the thing had been founded. The Western powers had excluded the Soviet Union from the Munich Agreement. The Soviets had entered into a pre-war pact with Adolf Hitler. Stalin was suspicious of the West, and Churchill was determined to contain Soviet expansion. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met on the deck of a destroyer off Newfoundland in the Atlantic and agreed to the Atlantic Charter. This document set up the war goals for after the war. In other words, they weren't going to have another repeat, Mr. Allinghouse, of World War I when France and Britain, I'm going to sneeze, I hope you'll pardon me, oh, sorry. And I'm back, Mr. Allinghouse. The British and the Americans were not going to have a situation like they had after World War I where France and Britain simply took over the conquered territories and its so-called protectorates. So, when the Soviet Union joined the war effort, the alliance was purely military, and all other questions were left behind. Questions such as, why the Soviet Union why do they violate human rights, etc., etc.? Why do we hate each other's guts, etc., etc.? Political questions were a source of contention that were not resolved throughout the end of the war. The first meeting of the Big Three, and the Big Three got their picture. The first meeting of the Big Three I'm very sorry. Allergies, Mr. Darlinghouse. First meeting of the Big Three was in Tehran, in Iran. And once again, all of the pictures of the Big Three during World War II of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt were always sitting down. And by the way, as these pictures goes on, they met a couple of times. More and more, you can look at FDR, and FDR he's a dying man. Yeah, he dies in 1945 before the war's over, but he is a dying man and not getting any better. The strain of circling the globe was probably too much for him. Okay, so the Russians agreed to attack Japan after Germany was vanquished. Because remember, Russia was fighting for its very existence. The main agreement was to attack the Atlantic front by the British and the Americans, to open a second front. This meant the Russians would dominate Eastern Europe. The Allies didn't understand this. Actually, Churchill did. But yeah, if you look at our map again, by the Allies simply hopping across the English Channel and attacking France, which is obviously the easiest way to do it, the most convenient, by doing that and attacking Germany from this direction, basically the British and France were surrendering all of Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union. Roosevelt didn't really think too much of this. Churchill, Mr. Arlinghouse, came up with a plan to perhaps attack what he called the soft underbelly of Europe and go up through here to attack Germany. It's an interesting idea, but if you know anything about the topography of the Balkan Peninsula and the Alps, there is nothing soft about this route. It is nothing but mountains and terrible terrain. Advancing through this would have been extremely difficult. Much easier to go across the flat plains of France, which is what they did. But once again, in doing so, they basically conceded Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union's dominance after World War II. So, Russia, at the time of the Tehran Agreement, was still trapped deep within its own borders. For 1944, the situation was different, with the Soviets breaking out of the country and heading westward, and Churchill went to Moscow and set up proposed spheres of influence. The Russia would get the Balkans, the West would get Greece, there would be an equality of influence in Romania and Bulgaria. This was unenforceable without the Americans, who were opposed to such things as spheres of influence. The three powers, however, agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. Sneezing time again. 4 zones of occupation. Yeah. Now, you take a look at this map, Mr. Arlinghouse. This is kind of interesting. You see this area here. All the area on this map that is colored, including this yellow area here, that is pre-World War II Germany. Now, and if you can tell by this map, after 1945, this is the Polish flag. Poland gets this. The Soviet Union gets this, and they get it outright. This is East Prussia. Germany's border was lopped off to the tune of some 300 miles. And, once again, there are German people living here. Here's the Polish corridor. The Germans lost territory in World War I, and now they're losing again in World War II. And then Germany was divided into zones of military occupation. I'll have to look up this flag because I don't recognize it, Mr. Arlinghouse. You see that? You see that flag? Of course, this is France. This I do not recognize. Maybe I'll give that to you for an assignment. But yes, the British occupied this zone. The Americans occupied this zone. And the Soviets, of course, occupied what becomes known as East Germany. Now, this is the city of Berlin. The old traditional capital in Berlin, too, was divided. As I'm sure you know all this, Mr. Arlinghouse. So let's get back to this. So, the Russians also wanted $20 billion in war reparations. And they collected, trust me. Forced labor, they also wanted forced labor from all the zones, with the Russians getting half of all the proceeds. Everyone agreed that the Soviet Union had a right to friendly neighboring governments. But the West insisted that these friendly neighboring governments be free and democratic. Roosevelt was determined to preserve democracy and self-determination. Stalin agreed, but he knew that he could not depend upon the Poles and the Romanians to be friendly after the war. That's an interesting thing, Mr. Arlinghouse. In 2016, I went to Poland for about 12 days. And I traveled about, saw several cities, and Poland's really cool because it has lots of war monuments. And yeah, there are war monuments to World War II, but there are also monuments left over by the Soviet Union, which we'll look at in a future chapter. Yeah, the Soviet Union was very good about building monuments to themselves and leaving them there. But I did pick up one thing. Every German chancellor since World War II, every German chancellor has visited Poland and has made an official apology on behalf of the Germans. And, the Poles said, yeah, you guys are jerks, and you attacked us. But the Poles have much more animosity towards Russians. They hate them. It was interesting. It was very interesting, yeah. They hate them. Probably because when the Russians came, they took anybody out of Poland who could be deemed as some kind of a intellectual leader, and they shipped them off to Siberia, and they were never seen again. And then, yes, the Russians, the Soviet Union, stayed in Poland for 50 years after World War II. But anyway, um, Stalin probably agreed, as he feared the Allies might make a separate peace with the Germans and then turn on him. Yeah, and that proposal was made, by the way. In February, the Big Three met at Yalta in the Crimea on February 1945. The Western armies had not yet crossed the Rhine, but the Soviets were within 100 miles of Berlin. The war in Japan had continued, and there was no bomb yet. Roosevelt was eager to bring the Russians into the Pacific War to save American lives. Roosevelt also suspected Churchill as a colonial, eager to preserve the British Empire. To encourage Russian participation, Roosevelt and Churchill made extensive concessions, giving the island of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands in the Pacific to the Russians, according to some of their desires in Korea and Manchuria. Roosevelt also pushed for the formation of a new United Nations. The Big Three met for the last time at Potsdam, which was a suburb of Berlin, but no Roosevelt. Harry S. Truman, Clement Attlee, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Stalin again met. Churchill had been defeated, Roosevelt had died, and yeah, these two rookies and Stalin. Germany had been defeated, and the news of a successful atomic explosion had reached the president. Russia's western border was moved far into what had been Poland and included most of German East Prussia. Poland was allowed temporary administration. I misspelled that, didn't I? Temporary administration over the rest of East Prussia, and Germany all the way east of the Oder-Neisse River, a condition that became permanent. In other words, as it says, in effect, Poland was moved about 100 miles west at the expense of Germany to accommodate the fact that the Russian border also moved to the west, but in Poland. Germany was divided into occupation zones, and Germany would be divided until 1990. Mr. Arlinghouse, I know that you envy me. In 1989, I was one of the last people to see the Berlin Wall still standing. A council of foreign ministers ruled Germany's allies. Romania, Hungary, it's terrible spelling. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Finland did not sign the treaty until 1947. The Russians did not like the treaty. The United States signed with Japan, and it signed a separate one in 1956. And yes, Mr. Arlinghouse, that ends us for today. That ends this unit. And we're going to go right to the next unit because we're sprinting to the end, Mr. Arlinghouse. In my classes, I intend to be through with this unit by Friday. So, goodbye, Mr. Arlinghouse. I will see you at a future date. Thank you for your cooperation. And